Washington did. I mean, he had his calling, and he did it as no one else had ever done. And we're going to spend time on George Washington in here. But for the sake of time, to get to the Declaration of Independence here, they signed the Declaration on July 4th. And by the way, when they had signed it on July 2nd, the word went out in the Pennsylvania Gazette there. And John Adams, for example, said, this day, you've heard this deal where he says it will be celebrated, should be celebrated with luminaries and fireworks and so on. But he was talking about July 2nd, because that was the day that they had passed this resolution of independence. It turned out July 2nd did not end up getting, it was July 4th, which it should have been. It was the official day when they actually signed the official Declaration of Independence. And it wasn't just a resolution. It was if we get to Judge Napolitano here, it was the first law that was passed by the Congress in America, at least by the new Congress. We had a Congress before. We had the Articles of Confederation that were ratified and started in 1777, ratified in 1781, and they went all the way until the new Constitution took over. But they never, ever, that I know of, passed any law that was of any significance, because it had to have unanimity. They were so afraid of giving too much power to the national government. We can all understand that, but they were so afraid of it, they just got to work, that they gave them no power to tax. They had to have unanimity, and so they were never unanimous on it, the 13 colonies. And so the first law passed by a Congress of the United States was the Declaration of, the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Timeline, Sam Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, they all worked together in the Committee of Correspondence. Taxation without representation, that came from Sam Adams. Thomas Paine, I wanted to say something about that. There was not broad support. There wasn't enough support. They just just 2 or 3 months before the Declaration of Independence, they didn't have enough support to pass it by a majority vote in the Congress, and so they were working on this. But as you know, Thomas Paine published his, had a tremendous impact. I don't know if we get told enough in school, but it had this tremendous impact. It was written about the common sense of declaring independence from Great Britain. And it not only had a lot of logical stuff in it, but it also had some very inspirational stuff that we've all heard, and I should have brought it with me, but these are the times that try men's souls, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. In tough times, they give up, something like that. But, pardon, can you quote?
Shrinks from his duties.
Shrinks from his duties, but those who don't, and stick it out and stick with it in tough times, like in Valley, they deserve the praise and so on of men and women, he said. And he said, among another one of the things he said I like is he said, "'Tis dearness only that gives all things their value. Gold's precious, it's rare, and diamonds and so on. 'Tis dearness only that gives all things value." And then he said, so should it surprise us that something so precious and dear as liberty should come at a high price? And so it was very inspirational. I mean, I'm getting inspired right now. But it was very inspirational, and it infected a whole lot of people, even leadership in America. And it came just at the right time, And like I say, they weren't ready. The Virginia, months ahead of time, the majority in the House of Burgesses there, their legislature, was ready to do it. But in the Continental Congress, they weren't ready yet to declare independence. Finally, they got around to declaring independence and making George Washington commander-in-chief. And let's see, First and Second Continental, the Declaration. All right, let's get to the Declaration of Independence now. You should all have a copy here. And what I did was just highlighted in yellow key parts, things that I would say are absolutely key parts of the Declaration of Independence. And then I underlined the ones that I said were the key parts, the ones that are phrases that hopefully we've all heard these phrases, and I want to emphasize those today. There are 6 paragraphs in the Declaration of Independence. The first paragraph is an introductory paragraph, but it does talk about, he talks about the laws of nature and of nature's God. It's the first time that it's used there. let me just say, the second paragraph is kind of the philosophical setup, not only for the Declaration, but for government in America. It's the philosophical foundation for it. And the third part is this long list of grievances that he writes up against King George III. And then the fourth one is saying we petitioned the king, and the fifth one says we've petitioned our British brethren, and they've ignored us too. And then finally, they get to the sixth one, which has some more of these founding principles of America. So I'd like to not read everything here, but if you just follow with me from when in the course of, what he's saying at the very beginning is, if we're going to declare independence from Great Britain, then really we ought to tell other nations why we're doing it, out of respect. So he says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, we're going to do that with Great Britain here, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God, whatever they are, Cicero, entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impelled them. But he doesn't declare the causes yet. He starts off to say where government comes from, where sovereignty comes from. So he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident was a word somebody else used. All of these phrases were words that someone else used. Self-evident that all men are created equal. It took us another 90 years before we resolved that with the Civil War, with a few steps in between, but that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator, by God, with certain unalienable rights. Again, that's the basis of everything in America, and it's the thing that makes us different than every other major nation in the world. Not just the old Soviet Union or communist China or North Korea, but it makes us different than England and France and Germany and so on, who's right. They may believe in God, and I believe that probably most of them do, but their governments are not based on that. They don't have a written or an unwritten constitution that's based on, they've come down, this common law has changed it from the divine right of kings. England still has part of that technically, but it's changed through common law. But we're the only major nation in the world that has a government based on the idea that the sovereign God has delegated it to us by giving us rights, unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, Locke had said life, liberty, and property, and others had too, but he used a little bit more poetic, expansive phrase, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, this is the social contract theory that we say came from Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. They all believed in the social contract. They all believed, even though none of the governments were doing it at the time, and they didn't have the temerity to suggest that governments ought to switch over to this, but they said, yeah, people do have rights because they're children of God and so on, and they suggested this social contract theory that we can and should create governments. Hobbes said, I like kings though. We should voluntarily, with a social contract, hire a king. He liked kings. He thought it was efficient. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Basic thing. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, because the governed, again, they're the ones that have the unalienable rights, they're the ones who are the sovereigns. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, institute new government based on whatever they think would bring them the greatest happiness and prosperity and freedom and so on. He goes on to say, towards the end there, that he says we shouldn't just overthrow governments lightly, though. You don't do that. We're willing to suffer and put up with things and try to change things as slowly and work with our leaders and so on. And then he says, such, about 4 lines from the bottom, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity that constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And to prove this, I got a list of them right here. And he lists all these things that, by the way, is very interesting when you take these things and you compare them to what's in, they settled it, they resolved every single one of these things in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. They took, whether he's talking about you know, who can set up the legislatures and set the times so the king would just move the legislatures around. And he wouldn't tell who, some of the people that he didn't like or that didn't like him, and he would only tell the ones that would vote his way, and move them all around, and he'd wear people out, he'd move them to places that were further away from James Madison or some of the ones that he was, George Mason, the ones he was trying to avoid. He had Quartering Act. All of these things are corrected in the Constitution, every single one of them. You read through this, it's just like a prescription for all these problems. We're going to solve these problems, and they address each one of them individually in the Constitution. But you know, you can read through that, and he's, you know, sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. You know, bureaucrats and standing armies without our consent, and he just fires judges willy-nilly and only allows the ones who will stay on his payroll and do whatever he wants, and so on. Takes away. So he gives that long list of how, and then he draws the conclusion. He says this is the fourth paragraph, the small one there on the back page. It says, we've petitioned for redress. Petitioning for redress of grievances was something they understood. It was a big philosophical thing at the time. We've petitioned for redress in most humble terms, and our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. And then he says this principle that a prince, king, or prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And then he says, and we haven't been wanting in our attention to our British brethren. They're our fellow citizens, and we've warned them from time to time and shown the king to be reasonable about next to last. They too have been deaf to our voice of justice and of consanguinity. I use that term about once every 50 years. I think I used it in 1965. I had to look it up again. Consanguinity is you know, kinship, that you're descended from. So
blood brothers.
Yeah, we're blood brothers. We're descended from common ancestors, right? So they're saying, you know, we're British. We're descended from the same planet, and by the rules of justice and brotherhood and so on, they ought to be. But he says, they too have been deaf to the voice of justice. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and peace, friends. And then the very last is another, just like the second paragraph, it sets out this beautiful language, most of which did not come from Thomas Jefferson. He was quoting others. I didn't read it to you, but in the Lee resolution that they sent to him, they said, see if I can find what it is, because the Lee resolution said three different things, all of which are in that one sentence. It said that the United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally resolved. It's almost exactly the wording that Jefferson humbly used, because it was good wording. It was exactly right. So Thomas Jefferson said, we therefore, the representatives of the United States, I highlighted the little uncapitalized U, because they weren't the United States of America yet, but they were generically, they were united. They were the states of America, and they were united. In General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, there they go, talking about God again, and saying that he gets to judge what's right and wrong, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, due in the name and by the authority of the good people. So it states the principle. It's the people. We the people have the right, because he delegated it to us. Authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. There's Richard Henry Latimer. That they are absolved from allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that it's free. You know, if I was writing that thing, I could not have been humble enough. I wouldn't have just put in there I'd have come up with some other language, and I'd have kidded myself that it was better than Richard Henry Lee's. But Jefferson is just a great person. So let's see. Absolved that all political connection between them and the state of these 13 colonies have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states, independent nations, meaning may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to ourselves our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. As you know, most of them, the majority of them, either lost their lives and or their fortunes, and or none of them lost their sacred honor. But their lives and their fortunes, they were identified. And if you ever read the history of the revolution, the British generals had all of their names, and if their armies were to get anywhere near these guys, they were to go out of their way and to destroy their mansions, their farms, and to take prisoner their families and so on. And so it wasn't just and of course it was Benjamin Franklin who famously quipped that we must now all hang together, or surely we'll hang separately. That wasn't something they said lightly. As they were going up to sign the Declaration of Independence, the whole day on July 4th, not on July 2nd, on July 4th, the day they're going to sign it, there was talk for hours and hours about the gibbet. The gibbet is the gallows. It's the deal. That was the law. The law that they were under, British law, was that if you go against the government, that it was death on the gibbet. And if you were someone who was particularly prominent, and the crown wanted to make an example of you, then you could be drawn and quartered, where the king would pull apart by 4 horses, and then your parts, if the king wanted to, in some cases, would send them to the 4 corners of the kingdom, and they'd put your head on and make an example of you. This was a serious thing that they all knew about, and it was a likely thing to happen. There were already thousands and thousands of British soldiers here, and they knew that there was going to be tens of thousands more that would be sent over when they declared their independence. I want to do this thing with Judge Napolitano, which is a transition between what we have been talking about, natural rights and so on, and what we're going to be talking about very specifically in Chapter 4, which is civil liberties, and it's the Bill of Rights, specifically in civil rights and so on. But does anyone have any questions or comments that they want to make while we're talking here about the Declaration of Independence? Because we have now declared our independence. That didn't solve everything.
Wasn't there a famous scene too, where they were looking at the back of this chair in which a sun was shown rising, and they said, "Is this
That was Ben Franklin.
Yeah.
Ben Franklin was, you'll see in this movie we're going to watch, they use that particular thing in there. But yeah, Ben Franklin gave a number of little famous, he was a really bright guy apparently. He said all these
Or Richard's Almanac.
yeah. Well, anyway, he said this was right when he's about ready to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he stops and he says to George Washington in the chair, he said, you know, I've all through this 4 years of this hot summer and so on, 4 months, I've often looked at the sun that's on the back of the president's chair, the chairman of the convention, without being able to tell whether it's a rising sun or a setting sun. And then before he signs the Declaration, he says, I'm now happy to report that it's a rising sun. He says, she's very happy it's a rising sun.
Well, just a comment that the disciples all died.
The what?
The disciples all died bad deaths too, following.
Yes, they did. Every single one of them, except for John the Beloved, who was promised he could stay until the second coming. But all the others were martyred and so on. I don't want to necessarily put them on the same level as the apostles and so on, but they were to be revered by all of us. I mean, you know, this, and when we watch this other movie, we'll find out that all of these men they had their, I mean, they were most of them were landed and had money and so on, and they had a lot to lose, and they were learned and so on, but none of them had it all right. Not even close. Not even close. But the sum total of what happened, synergy is too modern of a word.
Gestalt.
Pardon?
Gestalt.
Gestalt? Man, you're ahead of my.
All the sum of all the parts.
Is that a
the
German
whole is
word?
greater than-
Just all, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
The
The
all-
sum, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and on the really important stuff, nobody had it right. I mean, nobody had it right. But they eventually came up with this great document that, but it's not just the Declaration, the Constitution, but on the Declaration of Independence, they were all great men because they were willing to sacrifice and do the very best that they could. And they came up with a very simple document. Have you ever read other governmental documents, or you read a Constitution that's 12 pages or so typewritten with big margins and so on? Whereas others are 40, 50. Kenya just did one that's 198 pages. It's a pretty good, but you know, the more you say, the less you say. And we have this simple document. Okay, we haven't got the Constitution yet. Let's just, shall we try?
Okay, there's some choices, Napolitano and the Patriot Act.
It's one of three. It's right here. We'll do this one, and then when it's only like 9 minutes, and then there's a couple 7-minute segments. There are 2 of 3 and 3 of 3.
Okay.
Let's try that. See if you have a mic. Turn that
Yeah,
off.
put it down there. I'll put one of them.
Let's see if I can turn it up a little bit. You can go back and you hear it.
Even a poster you were going to nail to a tree had to have a stamp on it with the king's image. You think it was rough going to a post office? This was a foreign post office run by the king.
It's like your health care day. Pardon? It's like your health care day.
Okay, here we go.
When we were colonists, and all of this happened right here where we are. My God, we're in Valley Forge, of all wonderful places. When we were colonists and the king wanted to raise money from us, he and the parliament had ingenious ways of doing it. And one of the ways that they raised money was to enact the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act required that every piece of paper in your possession, a book, a pamphlet, a lease, a deed, a mortgage, even a poster you were going to nail to a tree, had to have a stamp on it with the king's image. You think it was rough going to a post office? This was a foreign post office run by the king in the colonies, and you had to go there and get these stamps. Question: how did the king know that his image was on every piece of paper in your possession? Answer: the Parliament enacted something called the Writs of Assistance Act. This horrible piece of legislation authorized British soldiers to write their own search warrants. So a British soldier would show up at your door in New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Delaware and handwrite out authority which authorized him to enter your house, ostensibly to look for the stamps. There was no judge involved. There was no evidence that you didn't have the stamps. There was no evidence that you had any documents that required the stamps. He was just permitted to enter, and while there, take what he wanted. Rum from the islands without a tax stamp, you can't prove you paid the tax on it, we're going to confiscate it. Furniture from the mother country, you can't prove you paid a tariff on it, we're going to confiscate it. By the way, we have 15 soldiers that need a good hot meal and a place to stay tonight. We're taking over your farmhouse. Enough was enough. We fought a revolution. We won the revolution. We wrote a constitution. And the whole purpose of the Constitution was to keep the government off the people's backs. The only reason the Constitution was enacted was because of the promise that the Bill of Rights would be part of it. So it is enacted, it is debated in 87, it's enacted in 89, and in 91 the Bill of Rights is added. And the Bill of Rights enumerates the liberties that we believe are ours by our birthright. When the Constitution was being debated not far from here in Philadelphia, there was a great argument about the origin of our freedoms. Question: where do our freedoms come from? Answer, if the person answering is Thomas Jefferson, from our humanity. God created us in His image and likeness, and as He is perfectly free, so too are we perfectly free. And when Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he answered that question for all time. Our freedom comes from our humanity. This belief is known as the natural law, that our freedoms are as natural to us as the fingers on the ends of our hands, the noses in the middle of our faces, or any part of our body or any part of our spirit. The first piece of legislation ever enacted by the Congress of the United States was to adopt the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, just as they signed it, just as they promulgated it on July 4th, 1776, is part of the law of the land.
This one's dead.
And so if anybody says to you, well, what do you do when the government violates our natural rights? You do what the law of the United States says you do. It is the duty of the people to alter or abolish a government that violates our rights. And so we wrote a Constitution, and the Constitution, because of the Bill of Rights, added specific guarantees of natural rights that the government couldn't interfere with. The right to think as you want, the right to say what you think, the right to develop your own personality. I've frequently told O'Reilly that's the right he should be most grateful for.
Yeah, this is almost.
The right to publish what you say, the right to worship as you want, the right not to worship if you don't want. The right to self-defense. The right to use a gun when the police are unwilling or unable to protect you. And the right to use that gun on the government if it steals our freedoms, if it's taken over by a tyrant. The most unique of American rights is articulated in the Fourth Amendment. And after the right to life, it is the greatest of rights. It is the right to be left alone. We call it the right to privacy. And it reversed the Writs of Assistance Act. And it said if the government has a target, someone from whom they want evidence, no matter how guilty is the target, no matter how widespread is the belief in the guilt of the target, no matter how accurate is the belief in the guilt of the target, when the government wants to get in your property or in your home or into your bank account or into your papers, it must go to a neutral judge. And it must present to that judge what the Constitution calls and what lawyers know as probable cause, evidence under oath that it is more likely than not that the target or the custodian of these papers possesses evidence of a crime. That was the law of the land in the United States of America.